Good morning, brothers and sisters. It's so good to look out and see so many of you with us this morning. We have been in a series, this being our second week of a series I've entitled Faith Works. And so far in the book of James, one thing has been clearly evident, and that is faith does in fact work. This morning I want to begin by looking back at James chapter 1 and verse 22. And I want you to do with me something that I hope will help set to memory this particular passage in your mind as you go forward from here this morning. James chapter 1 and verse 22, it's there on your sermon outline helper. It says these words, "Be doers of the word, not hearers only, deceiving yourselves." The point is this morning, the sermon title, "Let's Do This," is the fact that all of us have been called by God to do something. There's not a single person in this room that got an exception from that call. There's not a single Christian in this room who God said, "Oh, by the way, you can take the rest of your life off." But yet some of us are rocking chair Christians. We're quite comfortable where we're at in our walk with God. We don't want to get out of that rocking chair. It's our favorite place to sit. We're comfortable. Nobody asks us to get outside of our comfort zone. Nobody asks us to do anything uncomfortable or that takes that E word called effort. But I'm telling you, at the moment of your baptism, something took place in your life. In fact, when you rose up out of those waters of baptism, the moment you became a Christian, something supernatural took place. Do you know what that was? You see, when we as Christians come up out of those waters of baptism, we became the eyes and the hands and the feet of Jesus. So when you think about those three things, eyes that see, hands that work, and feet that walk, you think about the fact that there is a calling in this for all of us to be actively involved. In fact, the moment you became a Christian, you became an extension of Jesus Christ. So much so that in fact that we now represent Jesus. Therefore, when people look at you, let me ask you the question, when somebody looks at the way you conduct your life, do they see Jesus in the way you talk? Do they see Jesus in the way that you use your hands? And what you look at with your eyes and where your feet carries you, do they see Jesus in you? In fact, we now represent Jesus, and when people see us, they should see Jesus in us. The question is, when people see you, do they see Jesus in you? Because if you are a hearer only, there is no sign, an active presence of God's Holy Spirit inside you that someone else can see. You notice in that first thing, look at it again. Eyes, hands, and feet. Notice I didn't say the ears of Jesus. You see, God hears everything. He doesn't need our ears to know what's going on because God is omniscient. He's all-knowing. He knows who you are. He knows who you've been. And He knows who you are going to be. Are you going to be the eyes and the hands and the feet of Jesus? See, that's kind of what James is saying to us in this passage this morning. Look back at verse 18 for a moment there in your Bibles. It says that God brought us forth by the word of truth. That's the gospel, my friends. That is the word of truth. that we should be a kind of first fruits of His creature. Of His creatures. Now think of all the things that God created. There are some marvelous creations. When you look around at this world and what God has created, the many different creatures that walk planet Earth now and have walked planet Earth in the past, when you stop and you think about even the angels in heaven, do you realize that God thinks higher of you, thinks more of you than even the most angelic of angels? That ought to tell you something. That ought to make you feel good for a moment, that God sees you as that special, that God places in you that much confidence. And yet, God saved us so that we could be first fruits. Now, a lot of folks go, I don't even know what that means. First fruits. Is that something you pick from a tree? No, folks, we're talking about the first choice, the best opportunity for people in this world, for us to be an example to others of what it means to be a Christian. He chose us to represent Jesus Christ. Are you proud this morning to represent Jesus in your life? Yes. The problem is a lot of us here this morning have fallen short on recognizing the duty that we have to exemplify Christ in the way we walk, in the way we talk, in the words that we say, the way we treat other people. A lot of us have forgotten that the very first reason that God allowed you to taste of the mercy of Jesus Christ is so that you could exemplify that grace to other people. The problem here is that it doesn't always work out so well. See, the truth is, we as Christians, even though we'd like to sometimes, we don't always represent Christ the way we'd like to. And one of the main reasons that Christians fall in this, one of the main reasons that we as Christians fail to represent Jesus Christ the way that we ought to, is that a lot of us have listened to a lot of false information, ideology that has come in to the church and has warped many followers of God. This past week, the prosperity gospel has been on my mind quite a bit. Now, maybe you're sitting here this morning and you don't even have a clue what the prosperity gospel is. Well, I'm telling you, consider yourself to be very fortunate. Because right here in Houston, Texas, there are thousands of folks who follow and trust in the prosperity gospel. In fact, one of the largest assemblies of folks who consider themselves to be believers in Jesus Christ is located right here in Houston, Texas. You know that. Now, I'm not here to talk down about anybody, but that's been on my mind a lot lately. And it's sad when I even hear some of our brethren in the church talk about how wonderful some of these folks are, who teach this prosperity gospel, who promote this falsehood. Now, here's what it is. It's a heresy that teaches people fake things about God and about God's promises. But folks, that kind of heresy doesn't come from the inside, it comes from the outside. You see, you can buy all sorts of DVDs and books, and you can watch all these TV programs that teach people this: how to manipulate God to get what you want out of life. And folks, they'll tell you, if you've got enough faith and you want it bad enough, God is going to grant it to you. But I'm going to tell you this morning that we don't need the prosperity gospel to manipulate God. We do that pretty well on our own. If we're honest with ourselves this morning, It's not just something that we look on the outside to see happening. We're plenty good at it as ourselves. But I'm going to ask you, why do people act that way? Why do people do that? Well, the fact is, write this down and jot this down in your outline. People tend to make their relationship with God all about themselves. Now you tell me, am I right or wrong about that? Think about it this morning. This is the first kind of selfish. We tend to focus on ourselves first. Now, let me share with you an illustration. Maybe this will get it to you. A few years back, the Washington Post, they put out this poll, and 79, you might write this down, 79% of Americans believed they were above average in appearance. And get this, 86% of those polled believed they were above average intelligence. Now, excuse me, what's average? Are we talking about 50%? You see, the truth is, some of us have a vastly exaggerated view of our good looks and our intelligence. Some of us think we're a lot handsomer, if that's even a word, or more beautiful than we really are. That's okay to think good about yourself. I'm not telling you this morning you've got to look in the mirror and say, boy, I am so ugly. Oh. I'm not telling you that whatsoever. And I'm not telling you to look at yourself and say, you know what, that hole in the ground out there is smarter than me. What I am telling you is that there comes a time for many of us where we look at ourselves and we think so highly of ourselves that we begin to believe that our relationship with God should be all about us. In other words, there's a time when people think, and it's not hard for them to think that way, that their relationship with God is all about them. In other words, I want what I want because I deserve it. I want what I want. God, you better give it to me because I deserve it. I am better than the average person, so God, you owe me this. The second reason people think that their relationship with God is all about themselves, because think about it. How do we treat people when they first walk in our door, in our churches, and then are baptized into Jesus Christ? Honestly and sincerely, we do whatever we can to pamper them, try not to upset them. And over the years, when people have left our churches, who do we blame? We blame ourselves. We think, well, what could we have done different? Sometimes there are people that come into churches that feel like that church exists simply to serve them, and they're never going to be satisfied. I'm thankful here at the Waters Road Church of Christ. I don't know anybody yet that feels that way, but it happens in churches that people think the church exists to serve them. How dare you ask them to serve anybody else? Now, those of you who know me well enough, I don't think it's a surprise to tell you how much I love babies. Right? We had 5 of them. Come on, wake up, everybody. And whenever somebody has a new baby here in this congregation, I'm one of the first people that's going to run up and talk about how beautiful that baby is. I have never seen an ugly baby. Just doesn't happen with me. They're all beautiful. They're all God's creation. But do you know what babies do when they don't get what they want? I'm sure you do, right? They cry and they fuss and they pitch a fit. Folks, that's what's happening in our churches right now because we have a lot of Christians who have refused to grow up. They think that church is all about them, and so they manipulate things, and if they can't get their way, a lot of people say, well, Jonathan, there's a church right down the road. I'll just go there. Folks, if you are a church shopper, that's not doing, that's hearing only. At some point, you've got to get on the pier and jump out into the water. You've got to get your feet wet. And James tells us, don't go there, don't do that, don't have that negative mindset. Simply, what does James say? 2 words, grow up. Look at James chapter 1, verse 22 through 25. He says, be doers of the word, not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he's like a man who looks intently at his natural face in the mirror. For he looks at himself and goes away and forgets what he was like. But the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing. Folks, at some point, we have to quit just sitting there begging somebody to stop and feed us. At some point, and you know, I love you sitting here listening. If you weren't here, I'd have nobody to talk to. So I love you being here. But if all you end up is not doing, then you're going to end up being like the kid whom we all referred to as a spoiled little brat. So the question becomes, how can I become a doer? Well, I know this can be complicated, so I did a study of the Greek here, and the word doer in the Greek is poietes. Do you know what that word means? It means someone who does something. Well, that was complicated, wasn't it? I get paid a lot of money to do that. You see, when churches do their job right, when a local church is fulfilling their responsibility of equipping the members, equipping the saints, that is a biblical command for us. If we are doing our job of equipping the members, they are trained to serve. Folks, if the Waters Road Church of Christ is really doing our job, then our members expect to serve other people. If a church is not doing its job, our members expect to be served. If a church is equipping the saints expect to serve other people. Which way is it here at the Waters Road Church of Christ? It starts with each one of us individually saying, I'm done just simply being a hearer and being served. I've grown up. It's time to serve other people. Are you ready to do that? In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus, Matthew 7, verse 24 and 25, we opened this morning's worship with that text. The wise man built his house upon the rock, the word of truth. And once the storm beat down upon that house, it did not fall because it had been founded upon the rock. It's funny that we've learned that ever since we were little kids, and still there are those of us in this room that don't get it. Because if you really got it, you'd be doing it. It's very simple. Once you hear the words of Jesus, you do them. You don't wait until you know more, because I've heard my brothers in the church say, well, Jonathan, let me know more. Let me learn more. Let me sit under you and learn some more of God's Word. And once I know enough, then I'm going to serve. No, that's not the way it works. There was a young man who was baptized into Christ. A couple months later, his Sunday school teacher asked him, he says, listen, I just want to know, what have you done for Jesus Christ since you were baptized? And the boy replied, I can't do anything. I'm still a learner. Oh, replied the teacher. Well, when you light a candle, do you light it to make the candle more comfortable, or for it to give light? To give light, the boy replied. The teacher continued, and do you expect it to only give light after it's halfway burned? The boy answered, no. As soon as I've lit it, I expect it to give light. Very good, the teacher answered. Why don't you go and do that right now? Jesus said, let your light shine before men so that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Matthew 5:16. Folks, do it now. Your candle has already been lit. Do not wait until your candle is almost extinguished, when your life is almost over, to stop and say, it's about time for me to do something. But what should you do? Raise your hand if you drove to church this morning. Do you know if you drove to church this morning, you're capable of driving someone else to church this morning? Can you host an in-home Bible study? You say, Jonathan, I'm not a teacher. Well, you don't have to teach. Just host. In fact, invite a few folks over, and if you supply the food, you know what normally happens right here in Texas? People show up, because Texas, we love to eat. Do you think that only elders can do anything at your church? Or are you sitting there this morning thinking, that's not really my job, I'm not an elder? Do you know what elders are supposed to do? In fact, you know what? If you took a survey of many of the churches of Christ and a lot of our members, there would be a lot of folks who really don't know what elders are supposed to do. Folks, they are supposed to watch over the flock and help meet the needs of the church. That's their job. But you know what? You could do that. In fact, many of you in this room already do that. If you know somebody who has not been to church in a few weeks, you can write them a letter. You can let them know that you love them and you miss them and you can't wait to see them again. If you know that somebody has been in the hospital, you can go and visit them. Are they homebound? Is it somebody who's homebound? You could call them and simply chat for a while. Or you could take them something to eat or ask them if they need any groceries. A lot of folks here in this room do that stuff anyway. And I brag about you all the time. I am so appreciative. But the point is this, folks, you don't need a degree from a Bible college or a Christian university to do that kind of stuff for Jesus Christ. You just have to do what little you can for as many as you can and as often as you can. In World War II, Allied bombers returned to their base and they told a miraculous story. They'd been hit several times while in the air by German anti-aircraft gunners. But you know, none of the shells had exploded. And specialists carefully removed the shells and they took them to a safe place to examine them. And they found that the shells contained no firing pins. Now, where that firing mechanism should have been, there inside was a note written in check, apparently by one of the slaves in a German munitions factory. And what was written were these words: "This is all we can do for now. Wish we could do more." Folks, those slaves didn't think that they were doing enough. But for the crew of that plane up in that air who survived that day, they had done a powerful and impressive thing. They did what little they could, and that little bit made all the difference in the world. Folks, that's what Jesus is asking for. That's what Jesus is asking for. None of us in this room can do everything. But all of us in this room can do something. And that's something that you may do. Folks, it may make all the difference in somebody else's life. You never know what your little deed may do in the difference of the future of somebody else's life. One last thought. It's not enough just to do stuff. We all do a lot of stuff, but we need to do our stuff for Jesus. And that's what James is telling us here. Look at James chapter 1, 23 through 25. "For if anyone is a hearer of the word, not a doer, he's like a man who looks intently at his natural face in a mirror. For he looks at himself and goes away and at once forgets what he was like. But the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his..." It took me a long time to figure out what that meant. I've read that a number of times in my life, and it never quite hit home, but it finally did. Let me tell you why. Every morning when I wake up, I've got a routine. Raise your hand if when you wake up in the morning, you have a routine that you go through. And I'll get up, I'll get in the shower, and when I get out of the shower, the first thing I like to do is take a look at the beard. Used to, I was clean shaven every day, so I would spend that time shaving everything. But after a while, I got tired of doing that, and that's why this is here. But I still have that routine. But occasionally, I'll get out of that shower and I'll begin to do my routine and the phone will ring. You ever had this happen to you? And then you stop doing what you were going to do and you talk on the phone to whomever, whenever it may be, and you talk maybe 15 or 20 minutes and then you're done. But what happens is maybe you go into the kitchen and you begin to make your cup of coffee or your tea, and then you forget that there was other things you were supposed to do, like maybe fix your hair or brush your teeth. Nobody wants to be around anybody who hasn't brushed their teeth, right? We all have our routine. Man, have you ever been to Walmart and run into somebody who's still in their pajamas? It's like sometimes God goes, I know you're preaching about this, I'm going to let you see it. Went in Walmart the other day, and sure enough, there was a man walking in Walmart in his pajamas, and you think, did you forget the rest of your routine? You know, the part where you put on some real clothes? No, folks, I'm serious when I tell you that is a hearer, because a hearer is all about themselves. All right, going to close the lesson with a story about a true doer. This man lived in the 1800s, and ever since he'd been a boy, he dreamed about being a missionary in Africa. And folks, I'm serious when I tell you, it was a driving passion for him. And then, sure enough, he met a girl who shared that same dream. So they got married. And they were faithful members of their church. And they were constantly sharing Jesus with other people. And they planned and they saved their money for their ultimate journey into their mission work in Africa. Just months before they were to leave for their missionary journey, his wife took ill. It was obvious that she was not going to be strong enough to endure the hardships of being a missionary in a foreign country. So sadly, this young man and his young bride had to give up their dream. Not sure what to do, he eventually went to work for his father, a dentist with a small side business. And as his dad grew older, the young man took over that side business and found that he had an extraordinary skill at marketing their product. And that business grew. And it struck him one night that perhaps he could still help on the missionary field. He determined to build up his business with an eye towards using the income to financially support overseas missionaries. And he worked hard, and he built this company into a huge enterprise where the product became world famous and is sold in just about every supermarket and grocery store, even to this day. Oh, by the way, I haven't told you what that business was, have I? Last week's sermon was in the bag. You remember that? The business he took over for his dad was producing unfermented grape juices for churches to use in communion. That young man's name? I bet you know his last name. What? Welch. As in Welch's grape juice. Thomas Welch. And over the years, that business had supplied support to hundreds of missionaries who accomplished more on the mission field than he himself could have ever done. Folks, I'm awfully proud of you as a congregation. It's coming up on 1 year since the Lord has allowed me to come and be a part of this work. Have you ever heard it said that in most of our churches, 10% of the people do what? 90% of the work? I pray that one day we can be a church where people say, it's not 10% doing 90%. It's so much better than that. Do you want to be that church? I didn't hear you say a word. Do you want to be that church? Yes. Folks, and let me tell you, there's one thing standing in our way, and it's something that is standing in the way of many of our churches. And it's called complacency. Folks, a lot of us are satisfied. We're happy with the way things are. We don't really think there's a real need for this church to grow, and because everything seems fine right now. Why would we want to change anything? And why would we want to reach out of our comfort zone and talk to somebody about the gospel? Folks, complacency is one of the most detrimental attitudes present within the Lord's church. It was in yesterday and it is today. Do not let complacency keep this congregation from growing, or keep you from doing. If you aren't growing, what are you? You said it. Die. Folks, you don't have to do everything, but you do need to do something. The first thing you need to do if you're not a Christian, to get those feet wet, literally. You walk down in that baptistry this morning, we baptize you into Jesus Christ, and you come out of those waters, finished product of God's salvation. You have been saved by the blood of Jesus Christ, a brand new creature. But then it's not over. You don't say, well, I'm done. Let's see y'all later. Now, that's the moment where God says the candle is lit. Now, so let your light shine. Finally, this morning, there are some of you this morning who have asked for prayers of this church over the last year. Maybe you don't realize it, but you were shining your light brightly on that day when you walked down here and you asked for the prayers of your brothers and sisters. That right there, in the moment of your request, your light shined so brightly. Don't ever forget that. Maybe someone needs the prayers of this church this morning. Don't be embarrassed. Be proud that you've got a church family that'll be here for you and with you every step of the way. If we can help you, let us do so as we stand and sing.